Hello, good evening. My name is Dan Denvir. I am the host of The Dig, the podcast with Jacobin Magazine. Um, Relevant to tonight's discussion, I'm also the author of a book called All American Nativism: How the Bipartisan War on Immigrants Created Politics as We Know It. I haven't said the subtitle in a while. I think it's something like that. I am very grateful that Haymarket has put together this discussion on a really important book from John Washington, How to Close a Camp. We are also joined by Silky Shah and Harsha Walia, and I'm going to introduce everyone briefly, and then we are going to dive into a discussion. Um, John Washington, author of the book we're discussing tonight, How to Close a Camp. He's a journalist covering the border, climate change, democracy, and other topics. He's written for The Atlantic, Washington Post, The Nation, Intercept, other outlets. He's the author of The Case for Open Borders and The Dispossessed, a story of asylum at the US Mexico border and beyond. He's also a translator of books by Annabel Hernandez, Sandra Rodriguez Nieto, and others. His most recent translations include The Hollywood Kid by Oscar Martinez and Juan Martinez, and Blood Barrios by Alberto Arce, which won a Penn Translates Award. And both were co translated along with Daniela Ugaz. He's a staff writer for Lookout and lives in Tucson, Arizona. Silky Shah is the executive director of a really important organization called Detention Watch Network, a national coalition building power to abolish immigration detention in the United States. She's the author of the recently published book Unbuild Walls: Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition from Haymarket, and has been working as a racial and migrant justice organizer for over 2 decades. Last, but certainly not least, Harsha Walia, an award winning author of Undoing Border Imperialism. Trained in the law, she's a community organizer and campaigner in migrant justice, anti capitalist, feminist, and anti imperialist movements, including No One is Illegal and Women's Memorial March Committee. John, Silky, and Harsha, so good to see you all here. How you doing?
Great. Thanks, Dan.
To start out, John, I mean, immigration enforcement has so many terrible facets. Why, in particular, did you think it was important to focus on detention? Why is immigration detention, the camps, why are the camps so critical to the entire infrastructure of immigration enforcement that we're seeing unfold under Trump in such terrible ways right now?
Thanks, Dan. Good question to lead with. Thanks, Haymarket. Thanks again, Dan, Harsha, and Silky. Really glad to be here. Just want to say also that your three books, the multiple books from Harsha, have so informed my understanding and thinking, and this book in particular. So yeah, just everyone should check out y'all's books as well. Uh, yeah, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. I do make the argument that uh, immigration detention is one of the linchpins of the immigration enforcement regime. And there's a number of ways to illustrate this. And I want to give a couple of concrete examples and back out a little bit and talk a little bit more abstractly and theoretically. But in some examples that we've seen just this year, like late last year and early this year, where there were huge rollouts of almost like theatrical levels of violence by the second Trump administration with Border Patrol and ICE descending on cities, invading these cities, descending from Black Hawk helicopters, rolling out in force in the Twin Cities where I am right now. And the communities in a lot of these places stepped up in an incredibly inspiring way to push back against those levels of enforcement through not only ICE Watch, through emergency response when people were being arrested and abducted in the streets, but also through mutual aid. And when the violence escalated to the murder of two Americans in Minneapolis, there was international uproar, and the administration sort of backed down. But I think sort of is a key word here, because at the same time that all of that was getting so much attention, there were actually more immigration arrests happening in at least 4 other metropolitan cities at the same time that were receiving some local attention, but basically no national attention, or certainly any international attention. And so those extreme levels of violence and that sort of, again, like theatrical sort of invasion isn't actually necessary to affect these arrests, detentions, and ultimately, in many cases, deportations. So when the government changed tactics and decided to, sack then DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, or then whatever his exact title was, Greg Bovino, strolling around these cities in his greatcoat, uh, a lot of people sort of counted it as a win. But actually, since then, in just recent weeks, there has been another huge increase of immigration enforcement, another spike in arrests. Detention is going back up. And those kinds of violence, that ostentatious violence, is not actually necessary to affect the ultimate goal of this mass deportation, of whether it's, sometimes they say 13 million, but then DHS also tweets things like they want 100 million people gone, whatever that would constitute that population. And so they don't need to do that. There are more efficient ways to arrest people, detain people, and deport people. And we're seeing that right now in a number of different ways. One is, through the gutting of asylum and the arrest of asylum, through effectively mandatory detention, through the weaponization of U.S. Customs and Immigration Services, which used to be a benefits agency, bestowing visas, and now is, some of their agents are armed. They can issue warrants, and they're just directly shuttling people from obtaining visas, even people who have visas, to the enforcement arm of DHS. And so if it's not necessary to do these really disruptive sort of enforcement operations, what is necessary to affect this agenda is immigration detention. And they have spent a lot of money doing so. The amount that they are lavishing on attempting to increase bed capacity is astronomical and unprecedented. And I think that is also shows how much they're invested, not only financially, but in order to enact their goals of making sure that people can be detained. These folks couldn't be doing their jobs. They couldn't be out in the streets of Maine or Texas or any other place if they didn't have somewhere to keep people. So they need to have detention. And without that, they're not going to be able to conduct their agenda. And one other reason why I want to focus on detention, because there's other things that are important, but it's also a vulnerable piece of this machine. And, especially through Silky's work at Detention Watch Network, we have playbooks that need to be modified locally for sure, and especially need to be modified now as they are sort of re-strategizing and trying different ways to detain people. But immigration detention is not just this federal sort of juggernaut that is untouchable. They want it to be so, and we can get into how they're sort of shifting some of their tactics right now. But so much of the infrastructure depends on local decision makers and local economics. And those are vulnerable, targetable pieces that everyday people can show up at municipal or county meetings. They can pressure their local officials. They can, try to focus on permitting or licensing or accreditation or the workforce. And so there's all these ways that the local communities can really kind of push back. And of course, we have seen this done in just recent months. I mean, the warehouse model that a lot of people are probably familiar with is now utterly failing. This was part of the detention re-engineering initiative announced last fall, where they wanted to buy over a dozen warehouses for billions of dollars, some of them to hold up to 10,000 people. And in both red and blue jurisdictions, people were very upset about it, pushed back, and now they're selling those same things. So like, and the pivot there changes the way that we need to respond, but also proves that vulnerability. So it is a way that people can effectively actually push back against the immigration detention or immigration enforcement writ large.
Silky, can you expand on that a little from your perspective, leading detention watch? Why is it that detention in particular is such a critical facet of the overall architecture of immigration enforcement? I think, we see like the face of immigration enforcement, as John was talking about, is like ICE, Border Patrol agents, fascist buffoons like Greg Bovino. Why is it these camps that are kind of behind the scenes, invisible to the public unless they're reported on or protests? Why are they so infrastructurally critical?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to encourage everyone to buy the book. Here it is. It's like such an important resource. I'm really excited that it's available right now. Really grateful to John for all of his work on writing this book, and to Haymarket for just being such an incredible resource to our movements constantly. Um, so on this question, I mean, for Detention Watch Network, we focus on detention. For a long time, it was like two reasons. One is like detention is just absolutely inhumane in every way, which, John chronicles in this book. There's so many stories about it. I think it's one of the things I've had to reckon with. It's always been inhumane. It's always a place that has, people have like not gotten medical care, not received the things that they need, are locked up. People die in detention. All of that is at in like absolutely horrifying scale right now, and I think that's something that we're all reckoning with how much worse it's actually gotten under this administration. So we fight it because of that reason. We fight it also because it is one of the key tools for deportation. And I think that's what John was just laying out, what you're asking, Dan. Like basically, because the US has been so deeply committed to incarceration, the way they started to build this sort of like model of, hopefully I'm not frozen, the model of detention that we have right now is with the growth of mass incarceration, with the growth of the prison industrial complex. And so it was tied to people being detained, and that being sort of the way to like bring in people into the system and then sort of go through their process and then eventually get deported. And it's sort of like a core part of how people end up being deported. And you see that in places like Minneapolis and Chicago, where actually there aren't huge detention centers, at least for now. I mean, Illinois has done incredible work, which is featured in this book, to stop detention or like longer term detention. Minneapolis doesn't have large detention centers. They're trying to expand detention there right now. It's really important that people fight it in Minnesota. But in both of those places, as you were just saying, John, like the scale of deportations, the scale of arrests were still lower than in the Miami field office during that time, than in Houston during that time. Like the places where you have so much more detention capacity, more people are going to be targeted. So actually these efforts over the years to limit capacity is helping stop the scale of violence that we're seeing in those places, even though it's still so violent, and it's still important to understand it that way. So I think that, detention facilitates deportation. Detention is inhumane. It is a central sort of part of how the US immigration enforcement system works, deportation machine works, and it's the largest immigration detention system in the world currently. And I think under this administration, but also as we know, like abolitionist scholars have pointed out for a very long time, fascism operates through law enforcement. And in this moment, I think detention has become that testing ground for this administration to carry out this sort of like creeping authoritarianism that we're seeing. And so, which, is evident through cases like the students who were targeted, international students who were targeted for their solidarity with Palestine, and a lot of other tactics, the offshoring of detention. There's so many things that are happening. And so detention has played this sort of central role. And I think in this moment, there are so few levers of power to pressure actually to sort of shift things. And I think detention is a place where like where people are seeing it, which is actually really interesting because for a long time, detention was totally hidden. People didn't have, didn't really understand it. And I think there was like a lot more targeting of ICE agents or like, particular like police. But now I think people are seeing the role that this infrastructure plays.
I want to just tack on a little bit there for a second. Also to plug, I think there's a Detention Watch Network study that showed, what Silky was saying about if there's a detention center in the area, more people will be arrested. That isn't just anecdotal, but they, like a number of organizations, I believe Detention Watch Network actually studied this and found that when places close, when detention camps close, the number of immigration arrests actually go down. And the opposite is true as well. When they open, the number of immigration arrests go up. So the evidence there is very clear. There's a couple other reasons why I think we should focus on the camp. One is just to back out a little bit. Like historically, detention is a place, like I think you can think of it as a testing ground where the state tries out in completely opaque, unaccountable, and extra legal powers on an already marginalized population. And this is something that I can elaborate on in a moment. But another reason is obviously other aspects of the immigration enforcement regime are awful and violent and affect terrible pain and suffering. But these places, you can't really capture how bad they are. I mean, the stories that come out of them, you overturn any rock in the immigration detention landscape, and what you find is unanimous suffering. These are truly hellacious places. People are medically tortured. They are subjected to prolonged solitary confinement. They have almost no services. They have very little access to legal counsel, increasingly less and less. Like every piece of it is, absolutely a human rights crisis. And they're sitting there, they're languishing. Right now, over 65,000 people are in these camps. And their goal, the administration's goal right now, and they're far from it, and I don't think they're going to hit it. But their goal is to reach a capacity of 108,000. That would be more than doubling when the administration came in. So this is obviously, from their perspective, a key piece of this machine, and from ours too, is a key way that we can fight back.
Silky mentioned that the US has the largest immigrant detention system in the world, but it's certainly not the only immigrant detention system in the world. And in a moment, I want to get into the fact that the US detention system is in fact transnational itself. But first, I wanted to ask you, Harsha, if you could say a little bit in kind of comparative perspective what the immigration detention system landscape looks like globally, because the hardening of borders is unfortunately not just a North American phenomenon.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Can you all hear me? Am I freezing still? Okay, I'm going to hope that's a no. Thank you, Haymarket, for bringing us together, and just echoing the massive congratulations to John for publishing this incredibly important book, and for all of the storytelling and journalism and documentation you've been doing for so long. It's just so powerful and so needed. And thank you, Silky and Dan. Great, my audio is perfect. Great, no one needs to look at me. You can just listen to me drone on. And yeah, just appreciating all of you for your tremendous work for so many years, and how important it is. And I appreciate the question around thinking about this globally, because of course, as you noted, Dan, while the US has the largest detention system, it's certainly not the only one. And in fact, most importantly, some of the techniques of immigration detention, that we're talking about in the context of the US have actually been perfected elsewhere, right? So while the US always loves being big at everything, the kind of techniques that have been perfected in the United States have often been adopted from elsewhere. And so, in the last, I was going to kind of detail the global landscape, but I think what makes more sense is maybe to pinpoint some trends, in terms of what's emerging as patterns. So just by way of context, people may have heard in the European Union in the last month, a major piece of legislation. It was passed and it's about to be implemented, which basically expands return hubs, almost all over the world. Like the countries where people are going to be returned to are still under consideration. And this is a model that was pioneered by Australia, but this is basically outsourcing detention to third countries. So this, people may know this as third country concentration camps, third country camps, return hubs, etc. But it's basically outsourcing detention centers and detention camps to third countries. And the inhumane conditions that we've been talking about are just accelerated in Libya, for example. Refugee detention centers are literal sites of enslavement, open slave markets, which is not an exaggeration or a metaphor, right? Just incredible amounts of torture and violence that is enabled by the outsourcing of both border violence, but specifically detention infrastructure. And so I think the few kind of trends to make note of, and one is picking up on something, Silky, that you said, which I don't think is just, it's not just a word, but I think it's really important to understand is detention center as infrastructure, right? That detention centers as infrastructure includes detention centers, all the so-called alternatives to detention. It includes prisons, it includes jails, it includes refugee camps that are often seen as benevolent kind of holding sites, but are really sites of containment. And so this infrastructure expansion is global. And really driven by many of the same companies, the same logistics companies, the same arms companies, the same surveillance companies all around the world. And, really detention centers as testing grounds for many of these surveillances in the many of the same ways that, Palestine, for example, has become a surveillance laboratory by the Zionist entity. And so immigrant detention centers are also testing grounds. In fact, some of the first biometrics and AI that have now become kind of common use were tested on migrants in refugee camps and detention centers decades ago. And AI decision making was being tested out in detention centers, specifically because of the legal kind of gray area that detention centers are in many national jurisdictions. And so this infrastructure expansion, I think, is critical to understand globally, and also how that expansion is, one, being outsourced around the world, two, is really driven by kind of, racial capitalist agendas and the militarization of those agendas, and three, that it really is like, a network of detention centers and infrastructure and not a singular, just detention centers only. The kind of outsourcing of this infrastructure, I would say, is really the frontier of detention center expansion. So while, we look at countries like the United States or even within the EU or Canada, the imperial core, the outsourcing of these technologies is critically important to understand because it opens up new markets, right? This is really what it is. So when we see the US outsourcing to El Salvador, to Honduras, to Mexico, also, across the African continent, to Rwanda and elsewhere, it's forcing open markets to detention center violence and the expansion of that violence. The other thing around detention that is increasingly important with, overtly fascist, authoritarian, right-wing governments is detention as deterrence. Because while it is true, two things are true at the same time, ironically, particularly outside the United States. One is, if you open it, they will fill it, right? If you open it, detention centers will be filled. At the same time, it is also true that in certain jurisdictions, detention center capacity is going down. But that does not mean that deportations are going down. It just means governments are becoming much more efficient at deportation flights. However, so the places where detention center capacity is going up is places where detention is increasingly being used as deterrence, right? The kind of spectacle of ensuring that people know how violent detention is, how unwanted migration is, and the cruelty is the point. So I think it is both true that detention center as infrastructure is a key part of how immigration enforcement expands. And it is also true that it is a linchpin, particularly in right-wing fascist propaganda, because the spectacle of raids, of, build it bigger, is increasingly part of the point, especially when it comes to deterrence for ungovernable migration, right? To deter people from ungovernable migration in particular. The third trend is that detention is increasingly used as discipline. particularly as labor discipline. So as people, not everyone who is detained, of course, a vast majority are. Not everyone who is detained is deported. And that is also the point, right? It is to maintain racial capitalism, to ensure that migrants, particularly racialized, precarious migrants, remain as cheapened labor, and increasingly under conditions of austerity and neoliberalism and advanced stage capitalism. And so detention is increasingly serving that function of discipline. And I think, one of the most obvious ways in which we can see the reality of capitalism is, there is a lot in a lot of countries, a lot of people buy into the very racist rhetoric that one of the ways in which the wage floor will be lifted, or, jobs will be protected, for example, for American workers, is to deport immigrants. But one of the things that we have seen so clearly, including in the United States in the past year, is detaining and deporting more immigrants has not, has not actually increased the wage floor. It has actually meant that immigrants are working in much more precarious conditions. And a study came out in Minneapolis as well as in California, or not a study, but a survey, and it showed that people who were being released from ICE detention actually reported that they were going back to work for their employers for less wage, right? For a lower wage, because they were now much more scared. Their bosses could threaten them, and they were much more precarious. And so the kind of contradiction of racial capitalism is resolved through immigration enforcement at large, but detention in particular serves such a critical part of that disciplinary mechanism to instill fear and anxiety that is unparalleled. And so I think those are kind of, some of the trends that we're seeing worldwide around detention center expansion. And particularly, I would again emphasize the outsourcing of detention is something that we cannot lose track of, because it is the fastest growing form of detention, is detention outsourcing to third countries who have had little to no detention infrastructure, and they're seeing expansions of like 50 to 100%. That is all coming and driven by the imperial core. So those are some of the things I think to think through when we're thinking about detention center expansion globally.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point, Harsha. As Harsha pointed out, it's not just that immigration detention happens around the world, but that US immigration detention itself operates on a global scale, and this sort of extension, transnational extension of national immigration detention is something that the US is not alone in doing. We're seeing it in Australia, other places, but in the US, obviously, CICOT, the brutal torture camp in El Salvador, it's perhaps the most horrifying example of this much larger system that's emerging. John, why is this global scale, this moving of migrant detainees across jurisdictions, across national borders, why is it so important to the US immigration enforcement system, and why hasn't it emerged as so important in the way that it has at this particular historical conjuncture?
Yeah, a good question. One other study to throw on top of the survey that Harsha mentioned, talking about like the bottoming out of the wage floor, and how, like pick your analogy. Is it shooting yourself in the foot or cutting off your nose to spite your face? Like, it's not good economics to detain people, to deport people. There was a study from the Brookings Institute that came out just recently that in just the past year, since the past, whatever it is, 18 months of the second Trump administration, because of immigration enforcement, there's an estimated loss of over 660,000 jobs, which is such a high number. And this is like obviously not good for the local economies, whether you are a migrant or not. I think, to answer your question, you have to think about what borders do. And I think that borders, you can't consider them like this natural entity or even this inherent part of a society. Borders are a tool, and they are a tool for a number of different things. The enforcement of racial capitalism, or to be a little bit more precise, like labor arbitrage. I mean, you're able to pay people less if you can keep them on the other side of the border, but they're still making goods that will then be imported. And like, there's a number of other examples just like that. And so the shuttling and the either immobilizing or scattering, enforced scattering of people, of labor, of workers, is seen as a way to just extract a little bit more from their work that they do. And so the way that you're able to make sure that people have this deterrent effect is to keep them on the other side, and you're able to exploit them yet further. I think also there is another aspect of immigration enforcement that is a political tool, and it is used for populace to gain or stay in power. And it has been very effective. And obviously, where we're at right now is because of this fear mongering that has been happening for decades and longer, but also, it heightened ever since Trump came to the, limelight, riding down that escalator. And this is something that we, like, different nations and different populists have been learning from each other. The far right sees that, oh, this is an effective strategy, actually. Trump rose to power doing this. And, even when it doesn't quite make sense, like you mentioned Sekot, the dungeon that was built in El Salvador. Bukele also has very much welcomed receiving, or for a while receiving, deported migrants, and he sees the cozying up to the Trump administration as a way to maintain powers, to have some sort of international leverage. And you mentioned also Australia and the United States have been like leapfrogging each other in trying to crack down further and further and more violently on migrants. And the far right uses that to say, okay, if we scare the populace, if we're able to paper over all of the very real problems in our society, you look at environmental destruction, climate change, like enormous inequalities and rising inequalities, wealth gaps, all of these things. If you're able to find a convenient scapegoat and people buy it because they are ready to swallow like very baseless xenophobic rhetoric, and that's going to get you in power, then they're going to keep on doing it. So you need to combat the narrative to say that actually there are underlying problems that cannot be addressed by detaining and deporting people, because those actually exacerbate the problems in many ways. And yet it's just been a relatively effective strategy for a long time.
Silky, how has this offshoring of the U.S. Immigration Detention Center changed your work as an organizer? What kind of problems does that pose for an organizing program that I was operating within a certain geographic confines, and now has to think at a regional and global scale? What sort of new strategies, capacities does it require from you all?
I mean, I think, I will say on the piece around what it's pushing us to do, which I think is deeply necessary. And, I think Harsha's really been at the sort of leading the way on sort of pushing a more internationalist perspective on this. The U.S. organizing and civil society infrastructure around this work has been really insular, and it's really actually a huge challenge to push people to think outside of that box. And, I think, of course, like, the genocide in Gaza has been such a big part of like getting people to see beyond what's happening in the U.S. and the role of the U.S. abroad. I think for many years, I mean, Dan, you write about this in your book, but like for many years, the sort of narratives within the immigrant rights infrastructure was, we're not going to talk about root causes. We're not going to do we're never going to talk about like U.S. foreign policy as it relates to what's happening to immigrants in the U.S. or why migrants are coming. And I think in this context, and seeing how, this requires our work to actually be more internationalist. And when you look back at the 80s, for instance, that's when we actually had a much more internationalist sanctuary movement. And I think this is a moment where we're sort of reckoning with that for two reasons. One, to actually address the role of the U.S. abroad, and as Harsha so eloquently laid out, just like the way the infrastructure is growing beyond, and looking at things like Frontex in Europe and all the way all these things are operating and having more political education around that. But then too, it's like we actually just need these relationships. When you have somebody like Tuan Phan, who was who was actually deported from Vietnam, instead was sent to Djibouti and ended up in a shipping container for for several weeks, and then ended up in South Sudan. He ended up, it honestly felt like he was sort of like a prisoner of war. Like he was there for a year. Finally, he's back in Vietnam. But I think it's sort of unbelievable. So actually having these relationships are so critical to making sure that we can help people on the ground, depending on where they end up. I think on the flip side, the challenge is, I mean, one thing to name, and I'm completely in agreement with Harsha around this being a new terrain that we really have to pay attention to. At the same time, the numbers are quite small in terms of what's happening outside the US, and most of what's happening is still here within the US borders. And that's becoming like the traditional detention is then like seen as the better version. And so it's like we have to make sure we're fighting on both fronts. And then the other thing I would just say is, I mean, this is just the case for organizing in general, but I mean, it's very different than the Obama era, whenever people were feeling like they could come out of the shadows, quote unquote, and be undocumented and unafraid and do this work in public. Like that is the opposite of what we're negotiating right now. And I think why it was so critical to have that solidarity in Minneapolis, um, in other places. But I think this is one of the challenges, like knowing how scary detention is right now. The conditions are horrifying. You could end up in, a country you've never heard of before, hearing stories about people ending up in Eswatini, other places that they don't even know about. Um, it's really scary. And so I think there's this sort of forced attrition, of course, like people leaving on their own, people signing away their rights to get out of detention. There's a lot of stuff that it's doing to bring people back into the shadows too. That's really scary. So I think there's a lot of different fronts here, but I do think ultimately it just really pinpoints how much more we need to be an internationalist movement in thinking about how we approach this work.
Yeah, you made some interesting points there, Silky and Harsha. I want to ask you, if indeed, I'm not sure if this is true in other countries, but if indeed in the US, the offshoring of immigration detention is not really like operationally necessary, if it's not helping them meet that goal that Stephen Miller sits down and tries to hit every day of, is it it's above, it's 108,000, John?
Yeah.
108,000 people in detention at all times. If CCOT and Eswatini and all of these things that are so simultaneously cruel and absurd and Kafkaesque, and surreal, frankly. I mean, just putting people from Afghanistan and Panama. I mean, it's just like and crazy things. What is the point of it if it's not actually helping them get to that 108,000?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thank you, Silky, also for thinking through that too more in terms of what it might mean in the US context. One thing is I think it's important to understand that there's different kinds of outsourcing of detention, right? Like one is this third country type of outsourcing, like to CCOT and elsewhere. But there is also the outsourcing of detention, which is detaining people before they even get to the United States, which is actually much more significant numbers. As we know, for a very long time, the US was pumping money into Mexico, and Mexico was deporting more central migrants for a period of time than the United States was because of this infrastructure, which included detention, but just overall immigration enforcement infrastructure. And so the kind of third country, being removed to a country where you've never been versus a transit country is kind of the most egregious kind of face of detention center outsourcing, but it is not the most common. And it is not even the one they're most invested in, because the one they're most invested in is making sure people don't even make it to the border, right? So that is one that does require a lot of our attention as well. But to your point about, like why even put money into third country detention, and I think this comes back to how critical imperialism is in this question of immigration. So imperialism, both, of course, as a root cause of migration, as Silky, you were pointing out, how it has been so absent from certain conversations, certainly not globally. but that is a root cause of so much migration and displacement. But also increasingly, the kind of bilateral trade agreements that countries like the US, but EU countries and Australia make with countries for these third party agreements, even if the numbers are small, it's not really about the numbers. It's about what it represents in the broader context of imperialism and bilateral trade, right? So for them, it's about getting a foothold. It's often in exchange for mineral rights when it comes to mining companies, either an explicit exchange or a quid pro quo that happens to be timed along the same time. So that I think is important to understand. We can never really. That's why the logic of immigration detention, as John you were pointing out earlier, may on its face not seem to make sense, right? Because you're like, why are you deporting so many people if it's going to mean a loss in jobs, or why are you spending so much money to deport 5 people to a third country when you could actually just deport them probably back to their own country? It's actually because of the imperialist expansion of detention infrastructure and the expansion of imperialism generally. And I think the last point that I would emphasize, and I think this is so important to understand because often immigration is seen as a siloed issue. All issues are kind of siloed out. And immigration is connected to so many things, the expansion of the prison industrial complex, to militarization, to climate change, so many things. But in particular, increasingly immigration is one of the main things, like one of the main talking points in almost any bilateral trade agreement that the EU makes, that the imperial core makes, that the US makes, that Australia makes, that Canada makes, that Turkey makes. It is one of the key talking points in almost any bilateral agreement, even one that on the surface has nothing to do with immigration. And so that is how to understand the expansion of detention infrastructure. It is not only about immigration, it is about the expansion of imperialism and racial capitalism, and it is the foothold through which this expansion can happen into otherwise peripheral countries.
One note on racial capitalism that I think illustrates something you were saying earlier, Silky. You gave the analogy of, the Vietnamese man sent to Djibouti who felt like a prisoner of war. Um, there was 8 people who were deported from the United States earlier this year, maybe late last year, eventually to Eswatini, including a Cuban man. And he was profiled in the New Yorker, and his analogy was that he felt like he understood a little bit what the Middle Passage was like. A black-skinned man ferried across the Atlantic on a military transport plane. And what, like, I would like to see those receipts. Like, how much did that cost from how many countries did they have to stop through to deport 8 people? And like, it doesn't make logical sense, but I think you have to lean into exactly what you're just saying, Harsha, about like really what are the geopolitical strategic implications and the hopes that the United States is having. Those are still relatively rare cases, but as you mentioned, Dan, like so many people are, and for years, not just under Trump, but under Biden and a little bit under Obama as well, have been deported, who are not from Mexico, have been deported to Mexico. So, like, I spent a long time profiling a Venezuelan family, particularly a mother of 4, who was picked up in Tucson, where I live, and very swiftly, within about 12 hours, deported with 2 of her 4 children. So, family separation. She was put on the bus immediately upon reaching Mexican territory and bussed 1,000 some miles south to Villahermosa in the very southern tip of Mexico. She miscarried on the bus. She didn't even know that she was pregnant. She miscarried on the bus. And then what she wanted to do is find her way back to not necessarily the United States, but closer to her family, her husband, and her 2 other children. And the importance of having a more international network of organizers there really came into play. I mean, the people on the ground in Tucson found folks in Villahermosa, in Veracruz, in Mexico City to give her, I mean, like life-saving aid at that point. And it was sort of really ad hoc and they were scrambling. But if we don't have those networks and we don't understand actually how much of a player Mexico is in enforcing this agenda right now, a lot of those people are going to get lost in the system. A lot of those people are getting lost in the system and getting killed in the system right now. So it's critically important that we understand that immigration detention, the immigration enforcement regime does not end in the United States, does not end at the US border at all.
I want to step back briefly because I think all of us would agree that while things are now worse, they are far from new. And this is kind of, I mean, this was sort of like the central question of my book on immigration history, but it's also just kind of the central question that I think the left is always asking itself generally in this moment under Trump, not specifically with immigration, is how to frame, speak about, understand continuity and rupture, right? Between the bipartisan Republican Democrat situation we've come out of to this Trump 1 and then 2.0 moment that we're living under. So yeah, what's new about Trump 2.0? What's an extension from Trump 1.0? And then zooming out even more, what's a continuation of the bipartisan war on immigrants that we've seen since the early 90s, I think is a neat marker, though obviously we can go back to the settler colonial, the dawn of settler colonialism in North America. But like, yeah, so Trump 1.0 versus 2.0 and the ordinary 1990s through Trump bipartisan war on immigrants to Trump to now. What's new? What's continuity? John, starting with you.
It's such a huge question and kind of hard to answer, but I have gone back and forth ever since the second Trump administration came in. Is this what we're seeing, a difference in degree or a difference of kind? And I don't know. Certainly it's a difference of degree. Is it also a difference of kind? Like, not exactly. Like, he hasn't invented anything new here. He's just like really pushed down further on the gas. I think there is, and I sort of was alluding to this earlier, but it's not necessarily just the cruelty that's new here. It really is, I think, the efficiency. I think their stamina, and I think their adaptability. And I think that the latter point is maybe what is most alarming. There's so many different examples you can think about, but like I already mentioned, the weaponization of U.S. Customs and Immigration Services, but just sticking to the detention landscape. When the warehouse model started falling apart just a couple months ago, what we're seeing right now is the administration just trying out new tactics. So, we already saw something that was pretty new in Alligator Alcatraz, which is a state-run detention center. What they're doing right now is they just paid, I think it's $1.5 billion to CoreCivic for 2 detention camps in California. These are currently operating camps that were owned by and operated by CoreCivic, and the federal government paid them to be the owners of those camps. But CoreCivic will remain there and continue operating probably exactly the same way they've done before. And the idea behind this, and this was revealed in an earnings call by one of the CEOs, was that they might be able to shield themselves a little bit better from state lawsuits. And I think that sort of pivoting and adaptability is something that is new and pretty scary. And what they're citing here is, and this going back to some of the stuff that you've laid out in your book, Dan, the CEO name-checked the supremacy clause, which is this clause in the Constitution that the federal government gets to implement and enforce immigration law rather than the state governments. And they think that that will be some way that they can duck some of these lawsuits, because some of the lawsuits are succeeding. There's a number of ways. Like, I don't hold much hope for the courts saving us, but they are a tool right now that is in part very effective in individual cases with habeas corpus, with habeas petitions, or pushing back against detention camps. Like in Surprise, Arizona, this is a sort of a exurb of Phoenix. I've reported on this. I've been on the ground there a lot in the past couple of months. They spent $70 million to buy a warehouse to try to convert it, and it was diversity of tactics, all hands on deck, Big Ten sort of approach to pushing back. There was people showing up at municipal meetings. There was vandalism. There was kids protesting with signs, and a lawsuit. And the lawsuit from the state attorney general cited all that pressure and actually paused for now the opening of Surprise. And so like the courts have some role, but you also see this, and going back to your question, this is something where, you know, they're not taking that as a loss and just moving on. They're like, okay, so now they're calling them turnkey facilities. They're buying these places from the operators, or greenfield construction. They're trying these brand new sites where they're going to maybe smaller camps, but a lot more of them. And there's trying all these different ways, and they're just really being persistent. I think that is kind of something that's a little bit new. I wonder if you think that's a correct analysis, Silky, if that's new, or if we've seen that in other administrations.
Yes, okay, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'll get to the bigger question. On this point in particular, I think they're always trying to circumvent our strategy. And we've seen this before. We saw this with like a bill called AB 32 in California, where they were going to phase out a couple facilities, and then they went in and got the contracts directly with Core Civic and Geo. Like they're always trying to do this. And I'm like, in every way, the warehouse strategy, like you're saying, was the strategy to circumvent, like the fact that we have been successful at the local and state level, the fact that, even places like you were saying, Surprise, where they actually were trying to unincorporate the city to be like, we don't want this, because it's incredible. Hutchins, Texas, like there, all these places that you actually wouldn't necessarily see this, and going after, many connections to indigenous struggles, but a lot of this in West Texas is all about water and like the use of water for these facilities. And so I think there's, yes, it's both like new in some ways, but I think it's also like immigration is like enforcement has always been about logistics. I think the difference, and the thing I want to sort of dig in on here, is I do think the narratives are shifting. And I think that like it's always been about logistics. Any person who's worked on the PIC has, like, we've used the term warehouse forever. For whatever reason, it's really capturing people right now, which is great. Okay, like, let's just call all of this warehouse. That's fine. If that means you're going to fight it, I'm down. But I think the like thinking of, having like Todd Lyons, who's the former ICE director, say, we want to run this like Amazon. We want this to be a logistics strategy. Is that further dehumanization? And I think, to me, when I think about the sort of, what's changed and what hasn't, I think a lot of at least the sort of like, coming up on 25 years of 9/11, like I feel like very much in the 9/11 generation, like thinking about things after that period, like still in that era, there's like a good immigrant versus bad immigrant narrative that is like, even for, and again, Dan's book is such a great resource on a lot of this, but in the Obama years, good immigrant versus bad immigrant, it really, really focused on people who, again, were the like quote unquote felons, not families, the grandmother, not the gang member, that kind of stuff. And like, really, it's ingrained in our heads. But I think that was the narrative, and it brought a lot more people into the that's the last time we had the scale of mass deportations we're seeing right now. And obviously they're higher than they were under Obama, but they like, that was a time when we had like almost 500,000 people being deported each year. And so, I think under Trump, like Trump 1.0, like all the narratives were there. Under Biden, it really, because everything became about the border, it was like old immigrant versus new immigrant. None of these are new narratives. It's just like the shifting narratives. And I think what's happened, because especially the bipartisan infrastructure, and especially the Democrats, have really accepted, like I think Biden really accepted the old immigrant versus new immigrant frame. I think, the good immigrant versus bad immigrant, all of those things. And we understand that to be, again, like somebody who is seeking asylum, usually somebody who's Black, is considered quote unquote bad, or like not worthy of that support, right? I think that acceptance of it and this infrastructure that we've seen built up, especially in the sort of 90s to post 9/11 era, fueled the far right. And now we're at a place where everybody's considered a bad immigrant, right? Like, this is what this administration thinks. And then when you look at what's happening, I think what's been so challenging, especially in the sort of backlash to 2020 and the post like Black Lives Matter uprising era, and the summer of 2020, and the uprisings around the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. I think what's so hard is that when you look at the protests right now that have happened recently at Delaney Hall or everywhere else, I mean, even like progressive media, the whole narrative is around innocence. And so I think that's one challenge, is that in a moment where actually we've retreated on the sort of racial reckoning that like pushed us to have questions around abolition, pushed us to really, say, no, these are not the systems we want. We should defund the police. We should shut down prisons. Like now, because the sort of mass deportation agenda is so present, we have some room on immigration to make this case. But one of the challenges is because the way this is happening and this framing of the quote unquote worst of the worst, which is literally like the person that you're talking about, I think it was Orville Atoria, who I think is Jamaican, who was sent to Eswatini. Like these folks are, they have past murder convictions. This is the way they're making the case to do these really, you know, disturbing and like stretch sort of strategies, these trial balloons on, third country deportations and all these other things. And so I think, to me, this like what's shifting now is that yes, maybe there's some room on immigration and there's some room to say, actually, we don't want ICE. We're starting to like win there. But I think actually, for me, the question is like, what does the PIC look like if we abolished ICE? Like it's still there and we're still in this. And I think immigrants are still in that mix, right? And so I think there's some bigger questions there. And I think, so much of like the work that Detention Watch Network has done, the work that I focus on in my book is like how much has mass incarceration and the growth of the PIC changed immigration enforcement? I think the question for us is also how much does this pathological obsession with mass deportation, how is it changing prisons and policing and the military in the US and all these other sort of systems of control that actually keep this apparatus going?
Yeah, Harsha, what's your take, just to circle back to that bigger question around continuity and rupture, and maybe just because this is sort of part of your role in this discussion, to zoom out at the global level where we see all sorts of echoes of Trumpism across Europe, Latin America, elsewhere.
Yeah, the continuities are endless, so I won't expound on them other than to maybe just briefly say I think that the continuities are in particular like crimmigration, right? The increasing and continuous merging of migration and the criminalization of it, the kind of militarization of the border, the post 9/11 security doctrine, like in terms of post 9/11 security. And I think some of the things that are particularly maybe ruptures or escalations are in particular. Oh, sorry, I'm going to be right back. My kiddo has an emergency. I will come back to this.
All right. Well, we'll circle back to Harsha when she is back with us. I wanted to speak about something that John's book discusses at some length, and that, John, you brought up at the top of the discussion, which is that the system is actually rather vulnerable to popular pressure and organization. Why is that? What are the various ways that we can, either through more direct forms of action or through the electoral path of ousting the current regime at the ballot box, what are the various tactics and what sort of strategies do those tactics fit into in terms of targeting and ultimately shutting down the detention system?
Well, I think first it's really important to, and when we talked and I like formally interviewed you, Silky, while I was doing research of this book, one of the things that you kept on harping on was we have to see like our political horizon cannot be the midterms or the next presidential election. So like we have to see beyond that. I think we also, a parallel sort of idea here is that we have to see beyond responding to either an individual camp or another outbreak of anti-immigrant violence. Like we have to respond to those things, but we also have at the same time to keep in mind like we need to work towards dismantling and abolishing the system itself. So there is something like a playbook, and I cannot overstate enough like how much the work of Detention Watch Network has sort of informed all of us on that issue. Like there's so many different ways that they have modeled ways to shut down a camp or stop a camp from opening. The latter is a lot easier. To stop a new camp from coming in is so much easier, and it's not easy, than shutting down an existing one. But I think and I go to great lengths in the book to kind of detail how that has happened in some cases. And Detention Watch Network on their site has a number of like resource materials about this. Really, I think you have to think about it. It's sort of I was describing about surprise. Try everything. You have to. I think the first issue is you have to have some sort of like cross-bar solidarity. Like you have to be in communication with the people who are suffering the immediate consequences, and you have to be in communication with them constantly because things are changing and they have needs, and they're the ones who are ultimately going to lead the effort. And be prepared for it to take a long time. Like I spent a long time talking to someone in Etowah, which is a notorious camp in Alabama. And the campaign there, I think, took about 14 years to finally shut that camp down. And now it's reopening. Like you also have to think about some way to make a win more permanent or more lasting at least. But just all hands on deck, talking to your community, building a solidarity, across faith networks, across different just community organizations, and going to your local public elected officials. Like all of these are kind of obvious, but they take a lot of work. But one thing that I'd like to point out, which may be a little bit less obvious, is the importance of sort of standing on precedents and learning from like our elders in the movement. And like a couple examples here really stand out. One is Alligator Alcatraz in Florida. Like that didn't happen. Like that was, such a disgusting place. I mean, the abuses that happened there, people were put in cages outdoor in the sun, according to Amnesty International, like truly horrific, torturous conditions. And it didn't last very long, not only because it's a complete boondoggle and the state was, paying $450 some million a year to try to keep it open, but because of the legacy of that exact site. So the site that Alligator Alcatraz was rapidly built on, I think they said they opened it in 8 days, was also the site of a huge environmental fight in the very early 1970s. There, the indigenous nation, the Miccosukee Nation, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, the Friends of the Everglades, they were key into passing NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, passed in 1969. And that was one of the very first ever sites where there's an environmental impact study. In where Alligator Alcatraz opened last year. And that, again, the push for an environmental impact study on what the effects would be about Alligator Alcatraz opening was one of the reasons that it is no longer operating. Or you could look at the Twin Cities, and you already mentioned Silky, Black Lives Matter, and the huge uprising that took place in 2020. That absolutely set the stage for what we saw in December and January. But you can go further back to the American Indian movement, and you go back to the way that indigenous groups were fighting against police brutality, the same thing that they were fighting against in 2020. And like without understanding that history, I think you're going to be trying to start from scratch and having to try to get up to speed, and it's really hard. However, so try to learn that history and seek out those people who have been in that movement for a long time. And maybe in some cases, in some places where they're trying to put new camps in, or like Surprise, Arizona, which didn't even exist, 20 years ago. Like you don't have that history, but now you can forge it because there will be fights in the future. And it's really important that you do that so that the next generation, whatever they're going to be fighting, whether it's data centers or camps or whatever, they can have you now to look back on it and understand that, okay, we have this history of organizing. We have, like one last example. This is something that I found really beautiful. I talked to some other folks who pushed ICE out of airports in Vermont, and I profiled them in the book. And I was talking about like, wow, like I was so impressed by how quickly they organized and how quickly they stepped up and how effective they were. They chased ICE out of 2 airports in a couple months. I was like, how did you do that? Like, how did you build that sort of organizing capability? Like, oh, well, we have been doing, like, a lot of the folks came from like trans rights organizations who have been providing security to each other or fighting coal mining. And like they had those networks already built and they just changed their targets. And so like I think that like the history here is really crucial for actually how you can able to shut this down and hopefully keep them shuttered.
Silky.
I mean, again, plugging the book, there's a lot of resources. There's a lot of questions that are like laid out. There's an appendix with like all the things that you'd want to ask yourself, like how do you dig in? And the thing to say, I mean, Detention Watch Network, we work with people in 26, 27 states that are trying to fight either detention expansion or shut down an existing detention center. And so there's people maybe doing it in your community. If not, there's a lot of resources to support that. And so I think that's, like it is, there's a lot of room here to do this work. And again, detention, like, because there's so many limited strategies for, and many more people are probably going to be targeted because of the way the policies are shifting. Like, detention is a really important place. And also the ICE Watch programs. Like, I think those are the things that are so important right now. To just invest in, find your community, find the people that you can do this work with. It's really rewarding, actually. It's like, I mean, I remember when I got the text that morning about Etowah and what it meant. And yes, Etowah, I mean, and Etowah still was open because it's a jail, but the time, like, people would spend 7 years in a facility that had no outdoor space and and were there appealing their case constantly. Like, it was a horrifying place. And now, yes, people are detained there again, but it's for shorter periods of time. Like, that means something. Like, these wins aren't, yes, it might feel like a game of whack-a-mole, and it is kind of a game of whack-a-mole, and it sort of depends on who's in power. But I think there's a lot of opportunity right now. And then one thing I'll just mention quickly is Detention Watch Network is launching the End the Ice Age campaign tomorrow. And I think the thing to understand is, yes, it's great to get ICE out of your community, but ICE is much more than just the ICE agents or even just the detention center. Like, in places like Florida and Tennessee and Texas and Louisiana, like, it's the state troopers that are actually bringing so many more people into the system. It's really, I think what's great both about this book and the things that are out there is a lot of resources. Like, how does ICE work in your community? You can focus on these particular agents, but it's much bigger than that. You can focus on a specific detention center, but it's bigger than that. And so understanding the wrenches you can throw is absolutely essential. And I think in this moment, there's so much work for us to be doing, but I've said this before, like, ICE was created in my adult life. I do not think it's out of the realm of possibility that we get rid of it. And I know just ending ICE is not the thing that's going to get us fully where we want to go, but getting rid of it would be an important step along the way. And I think it's really worth spending the time to do that.
I want to throw in just 2 data points to back up what Silky was just saying. I mean, I completely agree. So, if you believe DHS, ICE has hired 12,000 new agents since the Trump administration came in. That might be true. It might not be true. I don't know. The number of local law enforcement agents who have been deputized to enforce immigration violations is higher than that. It's like around 15,000. At right now in my state, in Arizona, and also in Texas, there are 2 state laws that, well, Arizona just very recently went into effect, that consider it a state crime to have crossed the border from Mexico. So those are 2 escalations that have nothing exactly to do with ICE. I mean, you can get ICE agents out of your community and those will still be on the books, and those local law enforcement agents will still be enacting or enforcing immigration violations. You have to think system-wide. You can't just focus on a very narrow aspect of it.
We have about 10 minutes left. Harsha, I'm going to pose the question to you, and also if you want to kind of circle back to what you were saying before, sort of like what is the sort of like emergent global conjuncture, what's a rupture, what's continuity, and then perhaps fold in what's being done about it all over the world right now.
Thank you. And sorry about that. What I thought was an emergency was just my kid doing a wild dance. I was like, I better go. But all is well. Sorry about that. Took me a moment. Yeah, and just to go back to that piece around, yeah, I won't. I think I had probably wrapped up where I was at in terms of continuity. I was going to say in terms of rupture, a few things that stand out. One is that this is, I think, particularly true in the United States, but is being echoed elsewhere around the world. That is a bit of a, ruptures, it's not quite a rupture, but is much more explicit than it's ever been before. Is all of the previous narratives around immigration have quite explicitly focused on immigration, particularly, good immigrant, bad immigrant, or all bad immigrants, or, explicit racism against immigrants. But I think one thing that is becoming much more explicit, especially with the US regime right now, is the kind of collapsing of the homeland and the empire, right? And so that I think is quite distinct in the ways in which immigration is being very overtly being used to punish Palestinian resistance, for example, which is not new. We can look to the Holy Land Five, but is much more explicit. The ways in which Somali migrants and refugees are being talked about is much more explicitly racist, not only against Somalis, but because of the role that Somalia has been seen in playing in the civilizational war, right? By the US empire. And so I think the kind of collapsing of homeland and empire as part of immigration discourse is much more clear than it's ever been. And the other, again, not rupture, and this is, not ideologically driven, it's just a sign of the times, is the expansion of immigration through surveillance technologies. That has just expanded the web in ways that we have not ever been able to imagine, I think. And so I think those are two slightly different pieces about this moment around the world. And in terms of resistance globally, I just think there's a tremendous amount. And I think one of the things that I would echo everything that John and Silky have said, and maybe the piece that I would add or emphasize is just how much there is to do to fight immigration enforcement that may not seem like it is about immigration enforcement, right? So, tackling policing agreements. If you don't have ICE in your city, but you're able to tackle a policing agreement, that is effectively rupturing immigration enforcement and those tentacles. And so I think it is important to look at the system, not only because the violence is system wide, but sometimes it can seem like things are invisible because there may not be a blitz, there may not be a surge, but that violence is still happening. The deputization of local officers means that those are inroads that can be made. And so much of this infrastructure around the world is really just the rotation of prisons and camps and detention centers for different uses at different times, right? So closing and shutting down any carceral or militarization or like military infrastructure will have some kind of impact on immigration detention, even if not in the immediate, in the foreseeable future. So any kind of steps to minimize or reduce or eliminate carceral infrastructure or budgets as a whole has an impact. But also within that, because immigration is such a fundamentally connected issue to internationalism and imperialism, as we've been talking about, work to dismantle imperialism, to tackle the root causes of dispossession, to challenge trade agreements, going back to Silky's comment about the 80s and 90s, like that part of our work has really just kind of fallen to the wayside. And not because of us, because they're increasingly opaque and it's hard to know what's happening. But work to dismantle and challenge trade agreements is so important. And it's forefront of my mind right now, because right now in India, the farmers are resisting the US India trade agreement, so when I think about that, that is not a disconnected issue, right? Like movements for food sovereignty, indigenous movements, movements against unfair trade, capitalist trade, these are all fundamentally about immigration. And this is not an esoteric or theoretical argument. Like, this is also part of how we build those transnational connections. When we're talking about how many migrants are finding refuge, or finding sanctuary, or finding solidarity networks, or finding mutual aid networks in these various third countries, it is often these very movements that are providing those support networks and mutual aid networks, right? These are movements in these cities and countries and towns and communities. And so those relationships are so important to continue to build. One of the examples that I think about so often is particularly in the Filipino migrant rights movement networks. It is very clear and strong that anti-imperialist Filipino organizations are connected to Filipino domestic worker organizations and Filipino migrant worker organizations, because they're actually seen as part of the same struggle, and they're connected through this incredible transnational network of organizing that is anti-imperialist and migrant justice, because those are inseparable. And so I think those are also ways to understand this resistance, that it is about dismantling immigration enforcement and all of its tentacles and infrastructure. And also internationalist organizing is migrant justice organizing, is anti-capitalist, anti-colonial organizing.
I'm going to ask one question from the viewers. There were a few more, but I think we've actually mostly answered the other ones already, so that is a good thing. The question I'm going to ask and then add a little gloss to is, can you discuss the labor implications here? What does the ruling class have to gain in monetary terms from these labor camps? What I'll add to that is we have these big for-profit detention companies, Geo Group, CoreCivic, and I feel like this is sort of an analysis or a question that echoes and parallels questions and analyses of the carceral state in general and of the prison industrial complex. And there's like a very, I would say, common and mistakenly reductive reading of what prison industrial complex means that sort of locates the existence of mass incarceration in the profit motive of particular companies that have a stake in mass incarceration. That said, companies having a stake in this is not insignificant. It is not immaterial. So how do we think about that in the immigration context? And I'll let John go first.
All right. Thanks, Dan. That's a tough one. I feel like I was sort of trying to answer this a little bit before. I think Harsha did really great work, like kind of laying out parts of this, like, just the like, to use like a sort of a wonky term, like labor arbitrage. You're able to just like, leverage, and like I think thinking about the border as a leverage point or a fulcrum point by which you're able to exploit labor is really the best way to think about the border as a tool. I think that you're right, absolutely, to say that it's not insignificant, the role of specific companies. I mean, Geo Group earned a $250 million profit. I think that's like I think it's a 7,000% increase from the year before. That was last year. Like, that is not insignificant. And also just like the revolving door of this, like, I mean, absolutely kleptocratic society that we're in. Like, the number of people in the administration who have been working for Geo Group, the new director of ICE, David Venturella, the last director of ICE, Pam Bondi, like Tom Homan, the so-called border czar. And it goes the other way too. Like, they go back and it truly is a revolving door. They go back and forth. So they themselves, the plutocrats or the kleptocrats, are really raking it in. And the previous answer was a little bit abstract, but I think that we sort of covered it. Yeah, I'll leave it to Harsha or Silky to elaborate a bit.
Yeah, brief thoughts, because
I can be very brief. I mean, this is all about political economy, and the reality is that these, like, it's not actually that ALEC or whoever is giving so much money to lobby, members of Congress to get harsher immigration laws. Sure, that happens. But actually, the reason why, whatever member of Congress is supporting a detention center or prison is because it provides quote unquote jobs. Like that's the like their whole, like all of these locations, there's a political economy that is incentivizing this, and that's true for the 287G programs, the police ICE collaborations. That's money coming in from the federal government. All of these kind of things reinforce themselves. And I think when it comes to, the private prison thing, immigration detention in this context started with the rise of neoliberalism. So it's an intensely neoliberal model, and that's why these private companies benefit. But the reality is that private prisons grew under Obama and Biden as much as they did under Bush and Trump. And Trump, like, in fact, like they're, using so many more county jails, they just want to do detention. The private prison companies sure are going to benefit. It's crony capitalism. State and capital works together. That's what this is. But I think we need to understand it again of how the political economy and how the US economy in particular is so tied to, prison industrial complex comes from military industrial complex. These are sort of central, roles in the economy. And like that bill last summer, the one big beautiful bill was basically a jobs program. It's like, here, 12,000 jobs for ICE. Like, I think there is something to be said about, yes, it's these entities, but like this is a bigger question about the investment in these particular economies. And
Harsha.
I think this is one of those questions where outside the US kind of adds a different dimension too, because in many countries, of course, detention centers are largely nationalized projects. And they have a profit motive, but not to the degree to which the US does. So of course, in the US context, the kind of private prison, the crony capitalism, profit motive is a driver, but as Silky and John both pointed out, it's not the lens through which to understand it. And Dan, you mentioned this too. I would say it really is, and I think this is, John, and you touched on this too, it really is to understand the function of the border, right? The border is a spatial fix for capitalism, which is to say, the idea of a migrant is such a state constructed category. Like if you live within the nation state borders and you are a migrant, it suddenly means that you are subjected to a completely different legal regime of rights, even on paper. Of course, we know rights are flimsy, etc. But it can mean you get paid less than minimum wage. It means that, when your coworkers on your shop floor are going to unionize or are considering unionizing, there's a 50% chance that the tactic that will be used to union bust is to call some form of immigration enforcement. And that is common to various degrees all around the world, right? Where one of the main tactics to union bust is to threaten to call immigration enforcement. And that is fundamentally what the detention center is about. That's what the border is about. It is to create a different category of person who, despite living within the nation state territorial borders, if you will, is still a migrant, despite having crossed the border, despite living next door to us, working, alongside us, who is now entitled to a completely different regime of rights, largely to enforce racial capitalism and racial citizenship. And so that is really what the ruling class has to gain, is the entire identity and construction of the migrant as a migrant, as a person. And it benefits racial capitalism by creating a cheapened class of labor that can continuously be segmented. And the UN talks about this in policy speak as permanent temporariness. Like that is what policy elites love. They want migrants to continuously be on the move. And that is that, that shuffling around we were talking about earlier. Permanently temporary, right? So you're getting moved around, you're getting bussed around, you're getting flown around to serve racial capitalism, and you're just constantly precarious. So the ruling class has so much to gain from border enforcement. In fact, it is like a linchpin of racial capitalism today.
Well, on that note, I'm going to close us out. Huge thanks to John Washington, Silky Shah, and Harsha Walia, and a big thanks to Haymarket, which not only organized this event, but published John's wonderful book, How to Close a Camp. There it is. Please buy it. And yeah, hope to see you all soon.
Congrats, John.
Bye-bye.